In the summer of 2004, a young woman vanished during what was supposed to be a routine morning run in Salt Lake City. At first, the circumstances appeared familiar. A missing person report, a concerned husband, a community search that followed a predictable pattern. There were no immediate signs of violence and no clear reason to suspect a crime. But as investigators began verifying the details of the life she had shared with her husband, small inconsistencies emerged. Not in witness sightings or physical evidence, but in the story itself. Education records did not match. Employment histories could not be confirmed. The version of events presented to friends, family, and police began to fracture under basic scrutiny. What initially looked like a disappearance soon became something else entirely. A case shaped not by sudden violence, but by a carefully constructed lie that could no longer be sustained. Mark Hacking was 27 years old in the summer of 2004. He lived with his wife in Salt Lake City, Utah, where the couple had settled after their marriage the previous year. To friends, family, and neighbors, Mark presented himself as an ambitious young man pursuing an advanced academic career. He spoke confidently about his education, his professional future, and the life he and his wife were building together. According to the story he told, Mark was on a path toward a career in medicine. At various times, he claimed to be enrolled in medical school or preparing for admission. He described coursework, exams, and future training in a way that sounded credible to those around him. His explanations were detailed enough to discourage casual questioning, yet vague enough to avoid verification. Lori Hacking, his wife, was 27 as well. She worked full-time and was the primary financial provider in the household. Friends later recalled that she was supportive of Mark's academic ambitions and viewed their arrangement as temporary. She believed that her income and stability would allow him to focus on his studies, eventually leading to a more secure future for both of them. The couple's daily life appeared structured and purposeful. They lived modestly, adhered to routines, and discussed long-term plans openly. Conversations with family members often centered on education, relocation, and career advancement. There was no indication, at least publicly, that anything was fundamentally wrong. Mark had grown up in Utah and was familiar with the expectations placed on academic and professional success. His background and demeanor fit the narrative he presented. He spoke easily about university systems, academic timelines, and professional requirements. To most people, there was no reason to doubt him. What remained hidden was that Mark was not enrolled in the programs he claimed to be attending. Academic records would later show that he had failed to maintain enrollment, withdrawn from courses, and in some cases never been admitted at all. These facts were not immediately apparent to those around him. Universities do not routinely communicate enrollment status to spouses or extended family. The administrative complexity of higher education provided cover for vague explanations and shifting plans. As time passed, Mark adjusted his story to accommodate delays. Medical school became postponed. Postponement became redirection. Redirection became alternative academic paths. Each change was presented as strategic rather than corrective. The overall narrative remained intact. Progress was happening, just not yet visible. Lori accepted these explanations without apparent suspicion. Friends later described her as trusting and committed to the future they had discussed. There is no indication that she independently verified Mark's claims or contacted institutions on her own. The information she shared with others reflected what she believed to be true. Financial pressure slowly increased. Tuition payments that should have existed did not align with actual expenses. Expected milestones did not arrive. Still, outward appearances were maintained. The couple did not publicly argue about Mark's education. There were no reported confrontations with family members over inconsistencies. Instead, the deception expanded quietly. Mark continued to speak about future steps, applications, interviews, and upcoming transitions. These discussions reinforced the belief that the delays were temporary. Each conversation bought time, but also increased the complexity of the lie. As scrutiny increased, the risk of exposure grew. Friends and relatives began asking more detailed questions. Timelines were no longer abstract. Dates mattered. Institutions had names. Programs had requirements. Each answer required consistency with previous statements. Rather than correcting the narrative, Mark added to it. Investigators would later determine that the deception was not impulsive. It was maintained over an extended period through omission, misrepresentation, and careful control of information. Mark avoided situations where verification might occur. He managed conversations to limit specific follow-up. Lori's understanding of their life together was built entirely on this narrative. She continued to plan ahead, discussing relocation tied to Mark's supposed academic progress. To her, the obstacles they faced were normal challenges associated with demanding educational paths. This created a widening gap between reality and belief. The marriage, while outwardly stable, was built on information that was fundamentally untrue. There is no evidence that Lori was aware of the extent of the deception prior to her disappearance. By mid-2004, the structure of the lie had become unstable. Verification was no longer hypothetical. Academic records existed. Institutions could be contacted. The discrepancy between claims and documentation could not be reconciled indefinitely. The pressure was not sudden but cumulative. Every new plan introduced another point of potential failure. Each delay reduced plausible explanations. The story required constant attention to prevent collapse. There is no indication that Mark made meaningful efforts to resolve the underlying falsehoods during this period. Instead, he continued operating within the framework he had constructed. Investigators would later describe this phase as critical. The deception had reached a point where maintaining it required increasingly drastic measures. The life Mark presented to others could not withstand basic scrutiny. Exposure was inevitable. What followed did not begin with an argument or a confrontation. It began with the weight of a narrative that could no longer be sustained. The disappearance that would soon follow would bring years of deception into the open, not through admission, but through investigation. The carefully built lie had reached its limit. On the morning of July 19, 2004, Lori Hacking prepared to leave her apartment in Salt Lake City for what was described as a routine jog. Running was part of her regular schedule. She often ran early in the morning before the heat intensified and before the workday began. According to her husband, she planned to run along a familiar route near City Creek Canyon, an area she had visited before. Mark Hacking later stated that Lori left the apartment around 6 a.m. He claimed that she was wearing typical running attire and had intended to be gone for a short period. There was nothing in his account that initially appeared unusual. Early morning exercise was consistent with Lori's habits, and the location mentioned was a common jogging area. When Lori did not return within the expected time frame, concern gradually set in. At first, there was no immediate alarm. Delays can occur during routine activities, and there was no reason to assume something was wrong. As the morning progressed, however, her absence became more difficult to explain. By late morning, Mark contacted family members and friends. He expressed concern that Lori had not returned from her run. Calls were made to determine whether anyone had seen or heard from her. No one had. That afternoon, Mark reported Lori missing to the Salt Lake City Police Department. Officers responded and began treating the situation as a missing person case. At that stage, there were no indications of foul play. The initial assumption was that Lori may have been injured, disoriented, or otherwise unable to return on her own. Police officers interviewed Mark and collected basic information about Lori's routine, physical description, and intended route. They documented her clothing, her running habits, and the last known time she had been seen. Mark's account aligned with what others knew about Lori's daily life. Search efforts began quickly. Officers canvassed the immediate area around City Creek Canyon and nearby trails. Patrol units searched streets and access points. The terrain was challenging in places, but it was not considered inaccessible. Volunteers soon joined the search, including family members, friends, and members of the local community. Media outlets picked up the story within hours. Reports described a young woman missing after a morning jog. The narrative was familiar and easily understood. Similar cases had occurred before, and the early response followed established patterns. Posters were distributed. Photographs of Lori were shared with the public. Search teams expanded their coverage, moving farther along trails and into surrounding areas. Police coordinated with local agencies to ensure that all relevant locations were examined. During these early stages, the assumptions guiding the search were straightforward. Lori was believed to have gone running alone. There was no evidence of a struggle at the apartment. No neighbors reported hearing anything unusual. Her car remained parked at home, consistent with the idea that she had left on foot. The absence of immediate evidence did not raise suspicion. In many missing person cases, the lack of clear indicators is common in the first 24 hours. Investigators focused on locating Lori rather than questioning the circumstances of her disappearance. Mark remained present during the search. He spoke with officers, participated in media appeals, and contacted friends and relatives. His behavior, at least initially, did not prompt concern from law enforcement. He appeared cooperative and responsive to questions. As the search continued into the evening, attention remained centered on the jogging route. Searchers examined paths, wooded areas, and nearby neighborhoods. The assumption that Lori had encountered some form of accident remained plausible. Heat, terrain, and physical exertion were all considered potential factors. By the end of the first day, Lori had not been located. Police continued to classify the case as a missing person investigation. There was still no direct evidence suggesting a crime. The following day, search efforts intensified. More volunteers joined. Additional resources were deployed. Law enforcement reviewed nearby surveillance footage where available and followed up on tips from the public. None of these efforts produced confirmed sightings. Throughout this period, the logic of the initial assumptions held. Lori's routine supported the idea that she had gone running. The location was consistent with her habits. There were no immediate contradictions in the information provided. However, investigators also understood that time was critical. As hours turned into days, the likelihood of a simple explanation diminished. While the early assumptions remained reasonable, the absence of results began to raise questions. Detectives revisited the timeline. They reviewed Mark's account of the morning again, noting times and details. They examined phone records and attempted to establish a clearer picture of Lori's movements before she left the apartment. At this stage, there was still no reason to shift focus away from the search itself. The priority remained locating Lori. Investigators continued to operate under the belief that she could still be found. The case remained firmly within the framework of a disappearance. There were no accusations, no confrontations, and no public indications of suspicion. Everything about the situation, at least on the surface, aligned with a scenario that was unfortunate but not extraordinary. It was only later, as investigators began verifying details beyond the immediate search, that the assumptions guiding these early efforts would be re-examined. At the time, however, those assumptions were logical, consistent, and supported by the information available. The disappearance of Lori Hacking did not begin as a mystery. It began as a situation that made sense to everyone involved. That clarity would not last. As the search for Lori Hacking continued without results, investigators began expanding their focus beyond the immediate physical search area. This shift did not indicate suspicion of a crime, but reflected standard procedure when early efforts failed to produce answers. Detectives started reviewing background information, routines, and statements provided during the initial stages of the investigation. One of the first areas examined was the timeline of the morning Lori disappeared. Investigators reviewed Mark Hacking's account in detail, documenting the time he said Lori left the apartment, what she was wearing, and where she planned to run. These details were compared with phone records and known routines. At this point, there were no direct contradictions, but officers noted that the timeline relied almost entirely on Mark's statements. Detectives also began verifying Lori's daily schedule. They confirmed her employment, work hours, and typical routines. Co-workers confirmed that Lori was reliable and that her absence was uncharacteristic. There was no indication that she had planned to miss work or deviate from her routine that day. As part of standard procedure, investigators also reviewed Mark Hacking's background. This included employment status, educational claims, and recent activities. Initially, this review was administrative rather than investigative. Detectives sought to understand household dynamics and establish context, not to identify a suspect. It was during this process that the first documented inconsistencies emerged. Mark had told officers, family members, and friends that he was enrolled in medical school or pursuing an advanced academic path toward a medical career. Detectives attempted to verify this information through official channels. When they contacted the institutions Mark claimed to be attending, they encountered discrepancies. Records did not support Mark's enrollment claims. Investigators learned that Mark was not enrolled in medical school at the time Lori disappeared. Further inquiries revealed that he hadn't been attending classes as described and hadn't progressed through academic programs according to the timelines he had presented. These findings did not immediately indicate criminal behavior, but they contradicted a central element of Mark's narrative. Detectives documented the discrepancies and continued their verification process. Employment records were reviewed next. Mark's work history did not align with what he had previously described. Some positions he referenced could not be confirmed. In other cases, the duration or nature of employment differed from his statements. Again, investigators focused on documentation rather than interpretation. Detectives also examined daily routines within the household. They reviewed phone activity, movement patterns, and communications leading up to the disappearance. Lori's phone records showed no unusual activity. There were no messages indicating distress or plans to leave voluntarily. Mark's phone records were also reviewed. Investigators noted activity consistent with someone awake and active during the early morning hours. These records were logged, but did not, at that stage, contradict his account. As inconsistencies accumulated, detectives conducted follow-up interviews. Mark was asked to clarify details regarding his education and daily schedule. His explanations introduced additional complexity. Programs previously described as ongoing were now characterized as pending or postponed. Career plans shifted slightly with each clarification. These explanations were recorded and compared against verified records. The gap between what could be documented and what had been described began to widen. Investigators noted that the inconsistencies were not isolated errors, but part of a broader pattern involving Mark's academic and professional claims. At the same time, detectives reviewed financial records. They examined bank accounts, expenditures, and financial obligations. Tuition payments corresponding to the claimed academic programs were absent. Expenses did not align with the lifestyle associated with full-time medical education. These findings were documented as part of the overall case file. Friends and family members were interviewed again. Many expressed surprise upon learning that Mark's academic status was being questioned. Several stated that they had no reason to doubt him prior to the investigation. Lori, they said, had always spoken as though Mark's education was legitimate and progressing. This reinforced investigators' understanding that Lori herself was likely unaware of the discrepancies. As these findings emerged, the investigation began to change direction. While the case was still officially classified as a missing person investigation, detectives recognized that the narrative guiding early assumptions might not be accurate. The absence of corroborating evidence for Mark's claims raised questions about credibility. Investigators remained cautious. False statements alone do not constitute proof of a crime. However, they do affect how information is evaluated. Detectives reassessed the initial assumption that Lori had gone running that morning. While the scenario remained possible, it now relied on a source whose reliability had been called into question in other areas. This did not invalidate the account, but it required independent verification. Investigators attempted to identify any witnesses who might have seen Lori running that morning. None could be confirmed. Surveillance footage from nearby areas was reviewed where available. No clear images of Lori were identified. Search efforts continued, but investigative attention increasingly focused on reconstructing events inside the household rather than solely along the jogging route. By this stage, the investigation had uncovered a fundamental discrepancy between the life Mark Hacking presented and the life that could be verified through records. This discrepancy did not explain Lori's disappearance, but it altered how investigators approached the case. The working assumption shifted subtly. Rather than asking only where Lori might be, detectives began asking whether the initial account accurately reflected what had happened that morning. The case had not yet reached the point of accusation. No conclusions were announced publicly. However, internally, investigators acknowledged that the disappearance could no longer be understood without addressing the inconsistencies that had come to light. The cracks in the story were now documented, measurable, and supported by records. What they meant would become clearer as the investigation continued. As the days passed without any trace of Lori Hacking, investigators formally adjusted their investigative priorities. While the case remained classified as a missing person investigation, the emphasis shifted from large-scale search operations to detailed verification of existing information. This shift was procedural and evidence-driven, not the result of speculation or assumption. Detectives recognized that the search itself had reached practical limits. Trails, roads, nearby neighborhoods, and accessible terrain had been thoroughly examined. Volunteers continued to assist, but the likelihood that additional searches would produce new information diminished with each passing day. At that point, the investigation required a different approach. That approach centered on information already provided. Investigators began a structured review of all statements given since the day Lori disappeared. This included initial interviews, follow-up conversations, and informal accounts provided to family members and media outlets. Each statement was documented and compared for consistency. Mark Hacking was interviewed again, this time in a more controlled setting. Detectives focused on clarifying specific details rather than broad narratives. Questions were precise and chronological. Investigators asked him to recount the morning of July 19th minute by minute, including what time Lori woke up, what she said, and how long she was in the apartment before leaving. Mark's account remained largely consistent with earlier statements. However, consistency alone was no longer sufficient. Investigators were now comparing his statements against independently verifiable records. Detectives asked Mark to clarify his academic status. This topic had emerged as a point of concern during routine background checks. When confronted with discrepancies between his claims and official records, Mark acknowledged that he had not been enrolled as he had previously stated. He explained that he had misrepresented his academic progress to avoid disappointing others, including his wife. He characterized these misrepresentations as isolated and unrelated to Lori's disappearance. Investigators documented these admissions carefully. While the academic deception did not directly explain Lori's disappearance, it established a critical fact. Mark had provided false information about significant aspects of his daily life. From an investigative standpoint, this altered how all of his statements were evaluated. Detectives expanded their review of Mark's employment history. Employers were contacted directly. Employment dates, job responsibilities, and work schedules were verified. In multiple instances, Mark's descriptions of his employment did not align with documented records. Some positions could not be confirmed at all. Again, these discrepancies were documented without interpretation. Investigators did not assign motive. Their focus remained on facts that could be verified. At the same time, detectives reviewed phone records for both Mark and Lori. Lori's phone activity showed no unusual patterns in the days leading up to her disappearance. There were no messages suggesting she planned to leave voluntarily or meet someone that morning. Mark's phone records indicated activity during the early morning hours. Investigators noted call times, text activity, and location data where available. While this activity did not immediately contradict his account, it provided a more detailed picture of his movements and availability. Attention returned repeatedly to the absence of corroboration for Lori's supposed run. Investigators attempted to identify any witnesses who had seen Lori running that morning. They interviewed residents, joggers, and individuals known to frequent City Creek Canyon during early hours. None could confirm seeing her on July 19th. Surveillance footage from nearby areas was reviewed. Coverage was limited, and no footage conclusively showed Lori leaving the apartment complex or entering the jogging area. The absence of visual confirmation didn't prove she had not gone running, but it removed independent support for that assumption. Investigators also revisited the apartment. The lack of forced entry or visible disturbance had initially supported the idea that Lori left voluntarily. However, detectives recognized that not all confrontations leave obvious signs. The apartment was documented thoroughly, and investigators considered alternative scenarios. By this stage, the investigation had narrowed significantly. Detectives were no longer operating under the assumption that Lori's disappearance was accidental or random. They were examining whether the foundational narrative itself was accurate. Mark was interviewed again. This time, detectives confronted him with a broader set of discrepancies. They asked why his academic claims had been misrepresented for so long. They questioned how these misrepresentations fit into the timeline of Lori's disappearance. Mark maintained that his deception regarding education was unrelated to the case. He denied any involvement in Lori's disappearance. His statements were recorded in full. Investigators did not argue or accuse. Their role was to collect information, not to confront. However, the pattern was now clear. Multiple elements of Mark's life, as presented to others, did not align with documented reality. Detectives also re-interviewed friends and family members. They asked whether Lori had recently expressed concerns about Mark's education or employment. Several individuals stated that Lori had been frustrated by delays and uncertainty, though none reported knowing the full extent of the deception. Financial records were reviewed again, this time with greater scrutiny. Bank statements showed that the household depended almost entirely on Lori's income. Expenses associated with higher education were absent. Investigators documented these findings as part of the broader context. By the end of this phase, the investigation had clearly turned inward. The disappearance was no longer being examined solely as an external event. It was being analyzed in relation to verified contradictions within the household. Law enforcement began consulting with prosecutors. While no charges had been filed, investigators recognized that the case could escalate quickly. Ensuring that all steps complied with legal standards became a priority. The public narrative remained unchanged. Official statements continued to describe the case as an active search. Internally, however, investigators were preparing for a different outcome. The case had crossed a threshold. The early assumptions that guided the initial search could no longer be relied upon without independent verification. The investigation was now driven by documented inconsistencies, admissions of deception, and the absence of corroborating evidence. The missing person case had lost its simplicity. From this point forward, the resolution would depend not on where Lori might be found, but on what had actually occurred before she was reported missing. The answers would come from records, statements, and contradictions, not from the trail she was believed to have run. By the end of July 2004, the investigation had reached a critical stage. The search for Lori Hacking had not produced the expected results, and the inconsistencies documented in Mark Hacking's statements had grown too substantial to ignore. At this point, investigators were no longer evaluating general possibilities. They were testing specific claims against verifiable evidence. One of the most significant developments came from a detailed review of Mark Hacking's recent financial activity. Detectives examined bank statements, credit card records, and purchase histories from the weeks leading up to Lori's disappearance. This review was standard procedure, but it produced a finding that immediately altered the course of the investigation. Records showed that Mark had purchased a firearm and ammunition shortly before July 19, 2004. The purchase was legal and properly documented. However, it directly contradicted earlier statements Mark had made to investigators. During initial interviews, he hadn't disclosed owning or acquiring a firearm. Detectives documented the purchase and obtained serial numbers, receipts, and transaction timestamps. Investigators then traced the firearm through official channels. Ownership was confirmed, and the timeline of the purchase was established. The proximity of the purchase to Lori's disappearance raised immediate questions, though detectives remained focused on documentation rather than inference. When confronted with the purchase during a follow-up interview, Mark acknowledged buying the firearm. He stated that it was intended for personal protection. This explanation was recorded without challenge. Investigators noted that while the explanation was plausible on its face, it had not been disclosed earlier. At the same time, search teams continued to recover physical evidence from the City Creek Canyon area. Items believed to belong to Lori were located along the trail and surrounding terrain. These included clothing consistent with what Mark had described Lori wearing on the morning she disappeared. The location and condition of these items became a focal point of analysis. Investigators documented where each item was found, how it was positioned, and whether environmental exposure could explain its condition. The distribution of the items did not align with what would typically be expected if someone had simply gone running and encountered an accident. Rather than being concentrated along a single path, the items appeared scattered in a way that suggested deliberate placement. These findings did not stand alone. They were evaluated alongside other documented inconsistencies. Investigators avoided drawing conclusions based on any single element. Instead, they focused on how each piece of evidence fit within the broader context. With this information compiled, detectives scheduled another formal interview with Mark Hacking. This interview was conducted under controlled conditions and recorded in full. Investigators approached the interview methodically, presenting verified facts rather than accusations. They began by reviewing the discrepancies in Mark's academic and employment history. Mark acknowledged that he had misrepresented significant aspects of his education. He stated that he had done so to avoid disappointing his wife and family. These admissions were documented verbatim. Investigators then addressed the firearm purchase. They asked Mark to explain the timing and purpose of the purchase in relation to Lori's disappearance. Mark repeated that the purchase was unrelated and intended for protection. His responses were recorded without interruption. Next, detectives presented information regarding the physical evidence recovered in City Creek Canyon. They asked Mark to reconcile his account of Lori going for a run with the condition and placement of the items found. At this stage, Mark continued to maintain his original version of events. The interview extended for several hours. Investigators remained focused on documentation and clarification. They did not confront Mark aggressively or speculate about motives. Instead, they returned repeatedly to the same points, asking him to explain how his account aligned with verified evidence. As the interview progressed, Mark's statements began to change. He admitted that Lori had not gone for a run that morning. He stated that an argument had occurred inside the apartment. According to his account, the confrontation escalated, and he used the firearm he had purchased days earlier. Mark provided a detailed statement describing what happened next. He explained how he attempted to dispose of evidence and create the appearance of a disappearance. These statements were recorded carefully, with investigators asking follow-up questions to clarify timelines and actions. And importantly, investigators did not treat the confession as conclusive on its own. After the interview, detectives focused on corroboration. They compared Mark's statements with physical evidence, purchase records, and search findings already documented. The firearm purchase aligned with his account. The condition of the recovered items was consistent with just deliberate placement rather than accidental loss. Timelines provided during the confession matched phone records and known movements. Each point of alignment was documented independently. Based on the confession and corroborating evidence, authorities formally arrested Mark Hacking. He was charged with murder and related offenses. Law enforcement officials emphasized publicly that the charges were supported by evidence, not solely by Mark's statements. Following the arrest, investigators continued their work. They recovered additional evidence related to the disposal efforts Mark described. Each recovery was processed according to forensic standards and added to the case file. Throughout this phase, investigators maintained a clear distinction between factual findings and legal conclusions. Their role was to establish what could be proven, not to assign judgment. Statements were recorded, evidence was cataloged, and timelines were verified. The discovery of evidence and Mark Hacking's confession resolved the central factual questions of the case. The narrative of a jog gone wrong was replaced by a documented sequence of events supported by records, physical evidence, and recorded admissions. With the investigation complete, the case moved into the judicial system. What followed would be determined not by detectives, but by the court. After Mark Hacking's arrest, the investigation transitioned fully into the judicial phase. Prosecutors reviewed the complete case file, which now included documented false statements, financial records, verified purchase histories, recovered physical evidence, and recorded interviews. Each element had been collected according to procedural standards, with detailed documentation supporting its admissibility. The prosecution's case did not rely on a single decisive piece of evidence. Instead, it was built on a cumulative record that demonstrated how the original account of Lori Hacking's disappearance conflicted with verified facts. Prosecutors emphasized that the case rested on documentation and corroboration rather than interpretation. Formal charges were filed, including first-degree murder. Prosecutors outlined the factual basis for the charge, referencing the firearm purchase, physical evidence recovered in City Creek Canyon, and Mark Hacking's recorded statements. The legal theory presented was straightforward. Lori Hacking had not disappeared during a routine jog, but had been killed inside the apartment, after which efforts were made to conceal the crime. Pre-trial proceedings addressed evidentiary and procedural matters. Defense attorneys examined the investigative process and reviewed all materials provided by the prosecution. Motions were filed concerning the admissibility of certain statements and evidence. The court ruled on these matters according to established legal standards. Throughout this phase, the focus remained on facts rather than narrative. Prosecutors prepared to demonstrate how each element of evidence supported the reconstructed timeline. The defense evaluated the strength of the evidentiary record and the likelihood of prevailing at trial. Before the case proceeded to a jury trial, negotiations between the prosecution and defense resulted in a plea agreement. Mark Hacking agreed to plead guilty to first-degree murder. The decision eliminated the need for extended courtroom testimony in a protracted trial. During the plea hearing, the court conducted a formal review to ensure that the plea was entered knowingly and voluntarily. Mark acknowledged that he understood the charge, the rights he was waiving, and the potential consequences. The factual basis for the plea was placed on the record, referencing evidence already documented in the case file. The court accepted the plea. Sentencing was scheduled as a separate proceeding. During the sentencing hearing, prosecutors presented a summary of the evidence and emphasized the seriousness of the offense. They highlighted the deliberate nature of the actions taken and the subsequent attempts to misrepresent events as a disappearance. The defense was permitted to present information relevant to sentencing considerations under Utah law. These submissions did not contest the established facts, but addressed factors traditionally considered during sentencing. The court reviewed these materials without re-examining the evidentiary conclusions of the case. After reviewing all submissions, the judge imposed a sentence of 6 years to life in prison. The sentence reflected statutory guidelines for first-degree murder convictions in Utah. The court explained that parole eligibility would be determined by the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole, consistent with state regulations. With sentencing complete, the judicial process reached its conclusion. There were no extended appeals challenging the conviction itself. The guilty plea and sentence brought legal closure to the case. Beyond the courtroom, the case prompted reflection within law enforcement and legal communities. Investigators noted how the case evolved from a missing person report into a homicide prosecution through routine verification rather than dramatic discovery. The resolution depended on systematically checking claims against records. The case illustrated how false narratives can influence the early stages of an investigation without immediately revealing their consequences. Initial assumptions were reasonable, given the information provided. Only when verification began did the structure of the narrative collapse. Importantly, the investigation did not rely on psychological profiling or speculation about motive. The focus remained on what could be documented. Academic records contradicted claims. Employment histories did not align. Purchase records established timelines. Physical evidence supported reconstruction. The legal outcome reflected that approach. The conviction was not the result of inferred intent, but of documented actions and corroborated statements. The court's role was to apply the law to established facts, not to interpret emotional or psychological factors. The consequences of the case extended beyond sentencing. It became an example used in training and analysis of missing person investigations, particularly those involving close relationships. The case demonstrated the importance of verifying foundational information early and continuously. It also illustrated how sustained deception can shape decision-making. The false academic and professional narrative did not directly cause the crime, but it created a situation in which exposure became inevitable. Once verification began, the narrative could not withstand scrutiny. The case's resolution underscored the principle that investigative integrity depends on documentation. Each step taken by investigators was recorded, reviewed, and evaluated within legal standards. The outcome reflected that discipline. For the judicial system, the case showed how plea agreements can resolve complex matters efficiently when the evidentiary record is comprehensive. The absence of a jury trial did not diminish the factual foundation of the conviction. The story of this case is not defined by dramatic courtroom moments or unresolved questions. It is defined by process. A constructed narrative collapsed under verification. Evidence replaced assumption. Legal accountability followed. The disappearance of Lori Hacking began as a situation that appeared explainable. It ended as a completed criminal case shaped by records, corroboration, and judicial resolution. The final outcome stands as a factual record of how the case unfolded and how it concluded under the law.